All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to Unpacking the Science of Reading, a Defining Guide, a co-sponsored event from the Reading League Florida and the Reading League Georgia. My name is Jesse Steif, and I'm the president of the Reading League Florida chapter. And just a few short words before we get into the content of tonight's excellent webinar. I want to encourage everyone to keep up with your state chapter of the Reading League if your state has a chapter. Florida and Georgia's information is here on the slide, and we're always disseminating high quality resources that are directly applicable for teachers. So I want to encourage everyone to follow us on social media and visit our websites. While you're on our pages, I will encourage everyone to consider joining as members. Your membership in Florida helps us kind of keep the lights on and keep the high quality PD coming. We are an all volunteer 501c3 organization. And so this is only a labor of love that we all do for free in our spare time. And every spare penny from membership goes right back into the organization for things like insurance and Zoom subscriptions and things like that. So for tonight's webinar, we've opened up the Q&A function, and we welcome our live participants to ask questions during the presentation. Dr. Stoller will be taking some questions throughout the presentation and at the end. And so please remember to only use the Q&A to ask questions and not to make general comments, please, since it makes it a little bit difficult for us to work through all those entries. This event is being recorded, and everyone who registers will receive a copy of the recording in a follow-up email that will go out along with a certificate of attendance. We want to thank our friends and mission partners at the Collaborative Classroom for their generous support of the Reading League Florida. Collaborative Classroom, like the Reading League Florida, is committed, and the Reading League Georgia is committed to supporting evidence-aligned reading instruction and provides a range of services from publishing evidence-based reading curricula to a wide variety of professional learning opportunities. You can check them out at collaborativeclassroom.org. All right, and lastly, so it's my honor to introduce Dr. Stephanie Stoller. Dr. Stoller is the founder of Stephanie Stoller Consulting and the creator of the excellent resource, the Reading Science Academy. She is the former vice president for professional learning at Acadience Learning Incorporated, and she is a part-time assistant professor in the online reading science program at Mount St. Joseph's University, and is a founding member of a national alliance for supporting reading science in higher education. She's worked as an educational consultant, a fellow school psychologist, and an assistant professor in the school psychology program at the University of South Florida. She's provided professional development for teachers for the past 25 years and conducted research in the areas of assessment, early intervention, and collaborative problem solving. And today, Dr. Stoller will be talking to us about the excellent science of reading, a defining guide. Thank you, Dr. Stoller, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Jesse, and thanks to everybody at both the Reading League Florida and the Reading League Georgia chapter who have made this event possible. And thank you to everybody who is attending here live or listening to this recording. I really celebrate and applaud all of you educators who are taking on perhaps new learning about the science of reading. This topic is really, really important to me. And I think it's really something that we need to be engaging in and having conversations about. So I do want to encourage you to put your questions in that Q&A box. Those will go to Jesse and Nicole and Lisa, who are helping to host this event. And throughout the presentation, I'm going to pause and invite those questions. We will also keep a little bit of time at the end for your questions as well. So I would like to talk tonight about the insides of this new ebook, the Defining Guide, the Science of Reading Defining Guide. This is a way to have a conversation about the science of reading and a way to get all of the stakeholders related to education on the same page about what is the science of reading. So it's really a treat to have a little bit of time tonight to go through the guide and talk about the components. So I'm literally going to go page by page. I'm not going to talk about every page, but I'm going to go through the guide and try to illuminate a little bit, bring to life, and specifically talk about how this relates to your work in schools. So I invite you to download the guide itself. What is the scienceofreading.org? I think will still take you to that, and Nicole may be adding the link so that you can access this now. You don't need to have this in front of you, but it is a free ebook for download. You can also purchase hard copies, which is really nice. You can have a bound copy. You can purchase that from the Reading League. So really this effort was convened by the Reading League, and it's a nice coincidence that today is Maria Murray's birthday. So we have to pause and say happy birthday to Maria Murray. She convened a group of folks a while back to have this conversation about getting a national definition of the science of reading and really cultivating this movement to use this definition to explore what we mean by the science of reading and come to consensus about it, really. So the guide starts with this beautiful preamble. And if you participated in the launch event with Amplify last weekend, and if you've been to the website, you get to hear Tracy Whedon talking about and setting the stage with the reason why we're doing this work. And I know all of you as educators can connect to this, that literacy is that most essential human right. We have a responsibility as educators to make sure that every student, regardless of the circumstances of their birth, becomes a skilled reader. And that responsibility is one that we all take very seriously, and it guides the work that we do. So that's really the framework that we have when we're thinking about the science of reading. Because to me, the main reason for anybody to care about what's in the reading research is that it will make you a more effective instructor. It will help you to serve the students who are in front of you every day. So it looks like I have a little bit of a lag waiting for it to advance. Okay. I think what it skipped is my list of participants. And yeah, there we go. Crafting this definition. So Maria was our fearless leader, and she convened a very diverse group of folks from universities, from nonprofits, parent advocate groups, folks who work in schools, who are working in policy settings and so on. So it was a diverse group of folks, and really keeping that idea of serving students and serving educators in mind. So this is the definition. And what I want to do is talk about some of the specific words that make up this definition. And then I'm going to ask you to think a little bit about some of those words. So some of the ones that I want to emphasize and land on here that are part of the definition. First of all, that the science of reading is a phrase that you might be hearing just recently. It's become a little bit of a buzzword, if you will. But what we're talking about here is not a single study, but a vast group of studies, tens of thousands of studies. Reading is probably the most researched of all of the cognitive endeavors that we engage in. And so we have a vast amount of research that we can draw on. And it doesn't come from just one discipline or field. It's interdisciplinary. And the kind of research that we're specifically talking about in this definition is what could be called scientifically based. And we're going to unpack that in just a little bit more detail in a minute. What we're talking about here is reading, writing, spelling, so those topics related to reading as well as reading. And this is research that's been collected not just recently, but over the past several decades, that allows us to draw conclusions that can guide our work in schools with students, where we have a preponderance of evidence, not where there's just been a single study that might be interesting or intriguing, but where we've got a series of studies that are all converging around the same conclusions that give us really something that we can hang our hat on. And there are categories that we want to really focus on here. Specifically, the research that helps us understand how reading develops, why some students struggle with reading or what might go wrong, specifically so we can watch for those things with very young children or when we first start working with children so that we can prevent those reading difficulties from happening. The research that tells us the skills that students need to acquire to be good readers, how we should be teaching those effective instructional approaches that we can really rely on in the classroom, and guidance about how to assess and bring resources into schools to have the maximum benefit for students. So I want to get a sense of your familiarity with this definition. So we have a poll question that Jesse's going to launch up on the screen for us. So if you would take just a second to let us know about your experience. Do you know about the defining guide? Have you downloaded it? Is this new to you? You're familiar with it, but not really experienced with it? Or is this the first time you're hearing about it? And we hope lots of you are hearing about it for the first time, because that's the idea, to spread the word. So as the responses are coming into the poll here, I just want to remind you that this is a definition for you to use. Even if you weren't part of the group that had the honor of putting this definition together, we want your input on it. We want you to download the guide and to use this definition in your presentations, in your conversations, in your interactions with people you work with. Okay, how's it looking, Jesse? Do we have most of the folks responded? And do we get to see the results? Aha, oh, good. So most folks are new to it. Excellent. All right, so I'm gonna hope to do it justice in giving you a nice introduction here today. And any mistakes I make are mine alone. Don't blame the other folks who are part of crafting the definition. So in the spirit of having a definition that tells you what it is and what it is not, a la Anita Archer, the science of reading is not an ideology or a philosophy. So very specifically, we're talking about practices that are not based on hunches or intuition or our own experience or observation. We're talking about the conclusions that we can draw from experimental research studies. This is not a fad. This is not going away. As I said, this might be new terminology. We've called this reading research by other names in the past. You might have called it evidence-based practices. You might have called it SBRR back in the days of Reading First. This is not a political agenda. Literacy is that equal playing field. It really is a uniting topic. So this is not about politics. It's not a one size fits all. And as I talk about in a few minutes, the MTSS component of the science of reading, you'll see that there is a customization to the system, a customization to the needs of the student that makes it impossible for this to be a one size fits all approach. This is not a program. I wish it was that simple. I often hear teachers say, just tell me the list of science of reading programs. Just give me the menu of what I should be drawing from for my instruction. And although there are some things that we can really point to guide our work, it's not quite that simple. And so it's a much broader endeavor than just picking a program off of a menu. And this is not just about a single component of reading or instruction. This is not just about phonics, although phonics can be very, very important. So the reason why this definition was created and why we would like to ask all of you to learn about it, to understand it, and to use it is so that teachers can have this body of evidence to inform their work, so that school districts can have some guidance when they're making selections about policy, when they're making selections about programs, so that publishers can have some guidance in the materials that they create, and they can make choices to maybe shelve some of the things that are not aligned with the research, and really so that we can all get on the same page. So unifying all of the folks who have a stake in reading outcomes so that we're all working from the same playbook, so to speak. That's the idea behind this defining guide. So I'm just going to pause here and see if there are any questions about the definition itself, about what it's not, about the rationale for why we have this definition, or questions about how it can be used.
Dr. Stoller, it's Nicole. There's one question. Let's see, people are typing in right now, so I'm kind of watching it. But the one question is, does whole language or balanced literacy advocates have any science or evidence to support their claims?
Well, so that's a pretty broad question. We would probably want to get to the specifics, but there are certainly elements of what you would define as whole language or balanced literacy that have empirical research to support them. Those are the areas that overlap, I would say. And many of those areas will be things that I'll share when we're talking, I think, specifically about reading comprehension and language comprehension. So stay tuned for those elements.
Great, very good. Thank you.
Nicole. So I want to talk a little bit about this term scientifically based research. So I just want to elaborate a little bit on that terminology, because there's a lot of reading research and it's not all scientifically based. Why does it matter? Why do we want to draw attention specifically to what are called experimental research studies? Because the questions that we're trying to answer in classrooms every day are, should I teach this way or that way? Should I do this or do that? Should I choose this approach or that approach, right? You're faced with those decisions many times every day in the classroom. And there's only a certain type of research that can help you decide if A is better than B. And those are the experimental research studies. So what does experimental research involve? It means that we have an experimental group and we have a comparison group. And what's important is that students are assigned randomly to those two groups. This gives us confidence that any differences in those groups, after we have taught them something in a particular way, we've done some kind of instruction, having those two randomly assigned groups, experimental and comparison or control, lets us be able to make causal statements about this approach being better than that approach. And so that's what's really valuable. There are lots of other kinds of research. There's observational research. There's research that is case study research. We're just looking at one student or teacher. Those studies have their place, but they are not fitting the definition of what is the science of reading, because our specific question is about which instructional approaches work better in the classroom. So the other category of scientifically based research would be quasi-experimental studies, where we don't have that random assignment, but we try to get groups to be as similar before we teach them something as possible. So we try to have comparable groups at the beginning, again, so that after we have done something with those students, we can say that the difference is because of our instruction. So this is about exerting control on the environment, right? Not just observing what's happening naturally, but trying to put some boundaries around it so that we can say that what changed was the result of our practice. So another element of scientifically based research is really specifically defining and articulating and listing out what the treatment was, what the intervention was, what the instruction was, and doing that in such a detailed way that other people could replicate it. That is a really important component here. We also want to look for the students who were part of the study to be ones that are like our students. we want to look for what's called generalizability, that the results of the study actually relate to the setting that we work in, with similar kinds of students, with similar kinds of backgrounds and so forth. That helps us to be able to make that transfer from that research to what's going on in our classroom or our school. And finally, we want to look for research that's published in a specific place in what's called a peer-reviewed journal. And that can be a confusing term because these days, everybody does reviews of their peers. You might be reviewing products on Amazon, for example. That's not exactly what we're talking about here. This is a specific process that is kind of like quality control in the publication of research. So journals will have an editorial board made up of a lot of different researchers and practitioners with different fields of expertise who review any manuscript, any research study that gets submitted for publication in the journal. And that group of folks makes decisions about whether or not it should be published. And they look at the scholarship of that research. They look at the theoretical underpinnings. They look at the methods that were used. They look at the conclusions that were drawn by the study authors. And they give kind of a check on, is this all lining up? Is it all legit? And that process really weeds out the things that are lesser quality, I would say. So we want to be looking for research that's published specifically in peer-reviewed journals. So I'm listing that at the bottom of my slide here as primary sources of research literature, these research articles. And I'm going to show you a little bit about what that might look like. But there are lots of different types of publications that educators encounter and experience, and they are not all research. So this is a really important new behavior to take on, I think. And it's a really important responsibility that when you are encountering these different kinds of publications, when you're sharing what you've read in these different publications, that you're doing it accurately. So there are a lot of different ways that information gets shared in education. There are blogs, which are sometimes a way of disseminating research, but mostly people's opinions. And some of them are very good and very intriguing. I really like Margaret Goldberg's blog, The Right to Read Project, personally. There are opinion pieces that might be about someone's experience or somebody's thoughts about the research. Those can be published in journals, even in peer-reviewed journals like the Reading League Journal. Some of the articles that get published there are in fact opinion. And so just because it's in a peer-reviewed journal doesn't mean it's a research study. So you want to kind of keep that sorted out in your mind. There are secondary literature publications that are places to find research. So there are books that might compile the research, even books that translate the research into practice. So I'm thinking about Louise Spear-Swerling's new book on structured literacy would fit in that category, that allows you to access research in a very user-friendly, teacher-friendly way. You have to be careful when you're reading those books, those summaries or research reviews even, that what you're reading is actually what was the finding of the study. There are meta-analyses that pull together and analyze lots of different research studies. I'm thinking about one on repeated reading and reading fluency that I'm aware of. So that's a nice way to access lots and lots of research studies, but it's a specific type of publication. So what you want to be focusing on are these research articles. Not everything in print is research, and just because it has somebody's name in parentheses after a statement doesn't mean that that statement itself came from a research study. So just maybe some new information to keep in mind. The whole idea of a research article, again, published in a peer-reviewed journal, is its own type of genre. It's its own type of text structure, if you will. Almost every research article follows the sequence of sections that you see here. And this is something that you may want to learn more about. Being able to actually access research publications yourself and read through them. You might remember doing this in college or in graduate school. It might be something that you want to take on again. Following from the abstract, which is that nice, concise summary, to the review of the literature that led these researchers to their specific research question. And then from there, you should see a connection between the questions that they're asking and the methods of data collection. You want to look for really good, reliable, and valid assessments to have been used in the study. You want to have that very detailed description of what was done, procedures that could be replicated. It's really nice when you find a research article that you could take and implement in your classroom. That's what we want to look for. And then you want to look for the results to be communicated in tables and graphs and charts that allow you to digest exactly what were the findings of that study. The authors should give you the limitations of their research. They might give you some ideas for future research that could be done. And hopefully in that discussion section, they are giving you the practical application to schools and classrooms. That's really helpful when you find that at the end. So I have a poll question. Nicole, you want to add something before we go to the poll?
I do. So, oh my goodness, you don't get to see it, but we see behind the scenes, and there's some interesting, a couple of questions, but there's one that I think would be great if you could maybe speak to it. Where do randomized controlled trials fit into this definition of research?
Yeah, great question. So randomized controlled trials are the Cadillac of, they are the creme de la creme of studies, because there's the most control, usually the largest number of subjects are involved. Those studies are ones that really are done under very tight, high quality conditions. And they are the ones that we can have the most confidence in the findings of. They're very, very expensive. They are very time consuming, as you can imagine. We're talking about studying humans, little humans who can't give their own consent, whose parents have to give consent. So it's complicated to conduct these kinds of studies, but they're so valuable when we can have them.
Thank you for answering that. And there's one other question kind of pertaining to this as well, and it is, when researching, do I need to be looking for evidence-based interventions or research-based? Are they interchangeable? Thank you.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. Nicole, you might have asked me this question when you were one of our graduate students.
I actually asked you the exact question.
I remember it, and I remember what my answer is, and it's the same today. I know there are specific definitions of those terms. I've never bothered to commit them to memory. That's terrible to say. Somebody else on the panel or somebody in the meeting can give the official definitions. One of them is like the practice, it has some basis in research, and the other one is like research has been done on the practice, and I never know which is which. And one is a higher quality, right? You can have more confidence if this is a practice that somebody has researched under controlled conditions and found to be effective, that we have more confidence in that, versus sort of a newer practice that hasn't had any research conducted on it. That's promising. We like to use those kinds of approaches and practices, but we don't have as much confidence in those. And I never remember which is which, and it doesn't really, I guess I've lived this long without knowing which is which, and I'm gonna stick with that. So sorry, Nicole.
Thank you. And that was pretty much the answer I got 2 years ago. So the other question is, do you have any suggestions on how researchers can write research articles so that they can be accessible to teachers and literacy specialists?
Yes. So a while back, I was actually on an editorial board for this journal. It doesn't exist anymore, but one of the things that they did that was so helpful. Okay, I'm going to back up and say, no, I'm going to go there. One of the things that can be so helpful is to really detail the procedures. When you're studying instructional approaches, instructional practices, packages of instructional materials or approaches in the classroom, the more detail that the researcher can provide, the better. What they did in this journal that I had some experience with a while back is they actually printed at the end of the article like a script for the topic that was researched. So it was a step-by-step that you could literally tear out the page of the journal and you could go and try it with your whole class, with a small group, with an individual student, like that day. It was that detailed. And that was the whole point of that journal that I think was so valuable. So there are some barriers, and I think reasons why researchers don't do that all that much these days. One is space is limited in journals, and I'm sure that's a financial limitation. And the other is sometimes researchers are, they're working towards products that they want to bring to market, which is not money grabbing. That's actually a good thing. We want researchers creating products that eventually become published materials that everyone can use. So sometimes they're hesitant to, give away their proprietary goodies. So I can understand that. One of the real values of the Reading League Journal is that this is their mission, right? So I'm really going to encourage people to not just join the Reading League, which is free, but subscribe to the journal that is really geared towards giving practitioners that very specific information that they can digest and use from the research.
Okay, one last question, I promise, and that is, can you name the journal that you had experience with?
It was called Journal of Evidence-Based Practices, I think. And somebody can fact check me on that and fact check me that it doesn't exist anymore. Maybe I'm just no longer invited to be on the editorial board. I can't remember which it was. I think it was Journal of Evidence-Based Practices. I still have some of them up there.
Thank you. I am going to go silent again.
Okay. So I'm going to ask Jesse if he would launch our poll question. I may have missed one. So I'm going to ask for poll number 4. Sorry. So I'm going to ask about your interest in learning how to read journal articles. I mentioned that this is, kind of its own genre, its own text structure. And this is something that the Reading League chapters could support you with. And so we want to gauge your interest in learning more about this, how to really dig in and read research. So there's no right or wrong answer here. This is really just opinion, and it will help guide some of the future sessions that the Reading League chapters might engage in. Oh, so very evenly split here across the board. Okay, so some interest in this, a little maybe, and some yeses. Okay, awesome. Thank you all for that. That's very helpful. Before I move away from this topic, wanted to just share some quality indicators to keep in mind what you're looking for when you're reading those research articles. I think I've mentioned each one of those things. And give you some ideas about where to find research, because this is one of the real barriers, something that perpetuates that research to practice divide, is that research isn't accessible to practitioners. So I wanted to give you some things to think about where you might find research. Certainly you can subscribe to professional journals. I've mentioned the Reading League Journal. As a school psychologist, School Psych Review is one that I turn to quite often. Sometimes those professional journals are perks of being in a professional association. Here's something you can try that you might not have thought of. Send an email to the first author. And first of all, they'll just be thrilled that you are interested in their research, and they will very likely send you a PDF copy of their journal article or their study. You can find research, as I've mentioned, in books, in the IES practice guides, which are very accessible, and in other kinds of compilation reports from the Iowa Reading Research Center, the Florida Reading Research Center, from the regional education labs, and so forth. Online, there are lots of opportunities. Now, you have to be an informed consumer here, I think. You have to be a little bit choosy. And not all of these online sources are always going to have research. So you're going to have to be cautious about that. But I've given you a couple of ideas here. You can also, as I've mentioned, join the Reading League or other professional associations like IDA. You will get access to research as part of those memberships. You can access university databases. You can physically go to the library. If you're in a graduate program, you'll have access to library databases. You can phone a friend. You can connect up with local university professors or other university professors who aren't local to you. We are always happy to search up and share research with you. And so I would encourage you to take advantage of those options. Okay, I'm just going to pause. Nicole, I know you've been doing a good job of jumping in when there are questions, but any questions related to this research topic?
Yes, there are a couple of questions. So I think maybe if you could back up for just a second. I think there are a lot of folks looking in the questions who are new to this defining moment guide, and so they're really trying to wrap their head around what it is and what it isn't. One of the questions that came in is, are you giving us permission to use this definition as long as we cite you?
Yes.
So I think there's a little bit of confusion about what role the definition plays for everybody and how to use it.
That's great clarification. Yes, please use the definition. So it can be copied and put into slides if you're doing professional development, for example. It can be put into materials that you're disseminating among your staff, among your school community, parents, and so forth. There are citations that are right on the website because it's coming from now a published book or from the website. There are specific ways to reference where it came from. And so that's provided for you right there on the website because we want you to use it.
Along those lines, kind of just talking about what this means and how it's used. Another question was, can the science of reading be used along with other intervention programs such as Fonus and Pinnell LLI? So I think there's still a little bit of confusion about what is the science of reading versus what is a curriculum.
Yeah, good clarification. Sometimes the scientifically based reading research will be packaged into instructional programs. We like to see that because it makes it very accessible and easy for educators to use. The ones that Nicole just mentioned would not fit that category where you see either the reading research reflected in those programs, or you don't necessarily find research that supports the use of those programs in terms of improved outcomes for students when those are used. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of some of the contents of the science of reading, what's in this research, and maybe that'll help clear up some of those kinds of questions. Okay. Now, this is not going to do justice to any of these topics. This is a high-level overview or introduction to some of these ideas, hoping that you will be intrigued and want to learn more, okay? So one component that you're going to see in the defining guide is the idea of how reading actually develops in students. And here's the really, really important concept to write down and take to heart, is that we now know in the reading research that reading is not something that we come by accidentally or naturally. It doesn't develop. It doesn't occur incidentally when students are at some point developmentally ready. That's what we used to think, like when I started in graduate school, that's what we used to think. We know now that that is not the case. Reading has to be acquired. We actually have to recycle parts of our brain that have other purposes and create a new network in our brain specifically for reading. So nobody's born a reader. You're born with those other components to your brain, but reading is not natural. And you can contrast that to spoken language, which is natural. You put a child in an environment of German speakers, they are going to acquire the German language naturally, barring any disabilities. They are going to become an English speaker if they are in an environment of English speakers. So language happens naturally. Reading does not work that way. So that's one of the ways that we can contrast what we might call whole language or balanced literacy approaches that are kind of holding on to that old belief that if we create a literacy-rich environment, if we expose students to text, if we read to them, that they will, when they're ready developmentally, they will acquire reading. And that doesn't turn out to be the case. It can look like it's the case for some small percentage of students. Maybe 40% seem like they're becoming readers naturally without our intervention or guidance. But it's actually their brain is becoming wired. It happens a little bit more easily for them. They might not need the direct and explicit instruction that some students do. But the problem is, by the time we find out who has kind of gotten this on their own and who needs help to get it, they might already be a struggling reader and we've missed an important opportunity. So we need to capitalize on this information and understand that what we do as parents, what we do as teachers in the classroom can really cause the students to become readers. So that's the very, very important part. Instruction matters. So the kind of instruction that builds this network would be instruction that helps to link together the pronunciation of words, the exact string of letters in a printed word, and the meaning of a word. It's those parts of our brain that we have to network together in a specific way so that eventually when the student looks at the printed word, they will instantly access the meaning of it. So we build that circuit straight from the print to the meaning through that decoding, that individual letter sound system. So that's the really important piece. It's not a natural process. We have to build intentionally this network for students to become readers. And once you have an understanding of that, I think it helps to guide our actions and behaviors in the classroom. So that's an important understanding that's really not controversial within the science of reading. It's something we can actually see now on brain scans. One of the helpful models for digesting the science of reading and putting it into practice is called the simple view of reading. I'm not going to go into great detail here. I want to give you broad brush strokes and help you understand that we have lots and lots of evidence that reading comprehension can be explained almost entirely by the interaction of word recognition and language comprehension. So that these two broad areas of skill are interacting with each other to produce reading comprehension. That reading is a language-based skill, that what we want students to do when they read is understand as well as if they listened to that same content. And what holds people back, children back, from understanding the print when they are young or first learning to read is the word recognition component. They don't have that speech to print connection yet. That's what has to be built. So at the same time we're building students' word recognition skills, we can't forget about supporting their language comprehension skills. because without both of those major components, those sort of linguistic foundations of being a reader, the cognitive foundations of being a reader, children will not become readers. So this is a math problem. If students can decode, but they don't know the meanings of words, they don't understand syntax or morphology, they're not going to have reading comprehension. And the reverse is also true. If students cannot decode, but their oral language is intact, they're not going to understand what they read. So this model really helps us to support young children in acquiring reading comprehension, and it helps us to dissect what might be going wrong when older students are not demonstrating reading comprehension. So in terms of assessment, we can get a lot of guidance from the simple view. In terms of instruction, we can get a lot of guidance from the simple view. But you need to think about these as broad categories of what we need to support students in acquiring. So within the defining guide, you'll see a little bit, there's this language here. The following is a sampling of instructional practices in the category of word recognition. So on the left-hand side of the screen or the page, if you're looking at the guide, are the things that are well supported in the reading research in the domain of word recognition. So these would be things like drawing children's attention to the sound structure of language at the phoneme level, and explicitly and systematically teaching them the connections between phonemes and graphemes, and supporting them to apply that knowledge of phoneme grapheme connections in writing and spelling and in reading connected text. And you can see on the right-hand side of the screen or the page, some of the things that are not supported in research in the area of word recognition. So that would be things like once kids are in kindergarten, spending a lot of time focusing with everybody on larger units of spoken language, not the phoneme level, treating phonics as kind of an incidental or reacting to student mistakes as they're reading, rather than being purposeful and systematic, upfront and direct about teaching those letter sound relationships, or focusing on speed at the expense of accurate reading. That also is not supported in the research literature. So Jesse, we have a poll question number 5. I'd like to get a sense of what people would like to know more about in the area of word recognition. So any of the sort of sampling of what we've mentioned here that people are interested in knowing more about. Okay. So this will help your Reading League chapters to plan some future events for you. All right, let's take a look at the results. Okay, so morphology and connecting to spelling looks to be the front runner here, and building reading fluency is a close second. Excellent. Thank you all so much for giving that input. That is very helpful. So within the language comprehension component, a couple of practices that have good research support include reading aloud to students. So I'm just going to give a personal plug and an emphasis on reading aloud to students. Reading aloud specifically from complex and varied text that your students will connect to and that will expand their horizons. Text that is more difficult than what they could read on their own. This is really important, and I'm afraid sometimes teachers have gotten the wrong idea that they shouldn't do this anymore, or they shouldn't take time away from the decoding instruction to read aloud. Please don't misunderstand that. The word recognition skills do need to be brought up to automaticity and accuracy. But if the student can lift the word off the page, but they don't know what it means, or they don't know what it means in that string of words, in that order, in that sentence, or within that paragraph, it doesn't do them much good. So we have to be very mindful about keeping their language comprehension skills moving along, and building their content knowledge as well. And we can do that really nicely through reading aloud. And one of the most powerful follow-ups to reading aloud is having discussion with students. It's one of the best ways to build their vocabulary. It can have lots of other social advantages as well. And we want to make sure we're explicitly teaching these language component skills. We sometimes don't think about explicit instruction in vocabulary or in word order or morphology, but we need to be mindful of that. So the practices you'll see here that do not have a scientific basis would be reading aloud from the same text that the students are going to read. So reading aloud from predictable books or leveled books that students are going to have in perhaps a guided reading lesson. That doesn't allow students to build their language comprehension skills. We also want to avoid rote memorization or learning vocabulary words just for the sake of a vocab test, or learning vocabulary that's not connected to content that students are studying. So those would be some things to avoid. If you're looking for compilations of where some of this research can be found, there's an article that, there's a couple of articles that you'll see on my resource list at the end that will give you some good practical resources for this kind of information. So Jesse, we have a poll that asks what people would like to learn more about related to language comprehension. It might be number 6. So let's take a look and have folks respond here. So morphology is kind of one of those topics that relates to word recognition and language comprehension. I didn't list it here, but give you some other ideas to react to. Okay, let's see what the front runner was in language comprehension. So explicit routines for reading aloud. Excellent. And close behind, teaching grammatical structures. Yeah, good. Those are really important topics. So good input for your Reading League chapters to provide some additional learning for all of you on. So just before we move away from some of the components of the science of reading, I just want to mention that the science of reading is for all students, even students with disabilities, even English language learners, even speakers of English language variation, that what it takes to become a reader of English is the same regardless. And we have research to support that being the case. And I also want to, as I mentioned earlier, communicate that, oh, I've gone too far, sorry. Communicate that the systems and structures that we have in place in our schools, what we think about as multi-tiered systems of support, are the mechanism or the framework for implementing the science of reading. So I don't want to give you the impression, as I said earlier, that the science of reading is about choosing from a laundry list, like a menu of, you know, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. That is a temptation, I think, that people sometimes fall into when they first start learning about the science of reading. You have to be very careful to have a decision-making framework, like a problem-solving model that helps you ask questions about your school, ask questions about your students, and use assessment data to make a match between the needs of your students and the instruction and systems that you're putting in place for them. This is an important part of the science of reading that you don't often hear people talk about. It is what will allow you to take all of those excellent practices and innovations that exist in the research and contextualize them for your school in a way that will be doable and also sustainable over time. So if you're scratching your head right now and thinking, our MTSS implementation doesn't sound anything like what she's talking about, then you might want to do some additional learning about what MTSS can do for you related to the science of reading. We don't want people just, sprinkling around a smattering of disconnected programs and think that that's what they're supposed to do in implementing the science of reading. So this is a caution to think about the systems that are supporting the reading outcomes for all students within your school and district. Okay, I'm going to pause and see, Nicole, if there are any questions at this point before I give a call to action.
There are definitely questions.
Okay.
So, okay, I'm gonna, it's gonna be a little bit all over the board because they've been coming in, so.
Okay.
Okay, the first one is, somebody wanted to know about that reading fluency study you had mentioned. They're interested in reading that. Do you remember which one that was?
So the meta-analysis that I mentioned is Bill Therrien, if I'm pronouncing his name right, Therrien, I believe. And if people want to email me, I'm happy to share this, or maybe the Reading League would post some of these where they post the recording and handout for this. I know there have been other meta-analyses of reading fluency interventions and repeated reading. So I think David Chard, C-H-A-R-D, did one. I think maybe Sharon Vaughn has done one, V-A-U-G-H-N, I think.
Mm-hmm.
There are several.
Okay, thank you. That is very helpful. Another question that came in is there a journal that's specifically dedicated to the science of reading and teaching reading other than the Reading League journal that you know of?
So people can chime in. People who have answers to this, either put it in the question box or people on the panel can chime in. Reading Research Quarterly would be one that I would direct people to, where you're going to find some research studies that are very applicable to teachers in classrooms. All the journals coming to mind are ones that are more either compilations or opinion publications. So I'm going to ask for some help.
That was the one I was thinking of. I couldn't really think of like a just kind of evidence-based research that's being conducted. I'm not sure either. So
yeah, this is a real need. This is why the Reading League started their journal, is to do this translation for teachers. So they're filling kind of a void that's out there. Yeah,
that's a great question. This also I thought was a really interesting question, and it's about explaining why reading is not developmental. And this person does know. I mean, she goes on to say that, I understand that obviously finding out information earlier is better through quality instruction, but there are things our brains are better able to grasp as we get a little older. Like, for example, if you have a 3-year-old who can't hear alliteration or recognize their name, but a 5-year-old who can, how do you not explain that by it being developmental? And she says, I don't want to, she's avoiding the wait to fail model, but still she's being faced with this question of why would you say that there is no developmental aspect, I guess, to learning to read?
Yeah, that's a really good clarification. I appreciate that, because I'm not saying that there's not a developmental aspect to reading, and there definitely is. And what we can expect students to do at certain ages changes. We actually know a lot about that in certain areas. So maybe really, to be more precise, what I should say is that reading is not natural. It doesn't occur naturally. We're not hardwired for reading. It's not a default of our human brain. It's something that we have to build, that gets acquired. And for some students, like I said, it seems to happen a little bit more easily. That's what kind of fooled us for a long time into thinking that it was a naturally occurring process, that we just needed to sit back and observe and sort of nurture, but we didn't need to really direct it to happen. So that's maybe more what I'm talking about. It's not something that develops naturally, that if we just create the conditions, it will happen. Does that help with the distinction? I don't know if that person is
Yeah,
back and forth with you, but
no, that makes perfect sense. Actually, somebody did chime in regarding, we were talking about publications that people could look at, and somebody said they like Intervention Central.
Oh, the website Intervention Central. Yes, that's a nice nice translation of research to practice, where you can find a lot of what I was calling a script, you know, sort of the step-by-step how-to, a routine for implementing what's in the research. Yeah.
How about we do? How about maybe one more question, and then there are more, but we can
We'll do some at the end. Yeah.
Yeah. So this question is: I'm a high school teacher, and should we pay attention to Lexile levels or reading levels? If so, I'm finding it hard to find this information online. Any suggestions?
Oh boy, that's a loaded question.
I know, and that's why we'll take that one, and I'll let you handle that, and then I'll come back in a while.
Read it one more time, because I was queuing on a lot of different things there.
Yeah. So, and of course, I just moved it.
Oh, sorry.
Hey, that's okay. I can find it. It's this person is a high school teacher and was wondering about focusing on Lexile ranges or reading levels, and if so, where do you find this information? Like, should you be doing that?
Yeah, so Lexiles take into consideration two components of what makes text easier or harder, and not the third. So it attends to elements of syntax and elements of semantics. So word order, sentence complexity, sentence length, and the vocabulary that's in the text, the difficulty of the word, meanings. The Lexile formula doesn't take into consideration the decodability of the words. So the orthographic complexity of the words is not part of their formula, at least the last I knew, and somebody can correct me if that's outdated. So in high school, I assume you're working with struggling readers. I think the Lexile level is going to give you limited information, because your students are probably struggling with decoding. Many older students are. And so matching them to text based on the Lexile is not going to do it in terms of the decodability level of the text and the student. So I think you want to take into consideration text that students can read with a high degree of accuracy. That's the kind of match that you want to get for their instruction. Sometimes people call that reading level. You want to look for very, very high accuracy if a student can read that text accurately. And you want to get at, if the student is struggling with word recognition and decoding, you want to get at the fine-grained detail about what patterns they can read instantly and which ones they don't yet know. And you're going to need a diagnostic decoding assessment to do that. And for even some of those high school readers, you're going to want to provide them with practice in text that allows them enough repetitions of seeing words with the patterns that you just taught, so that they can move from being able to read those patterns accurately to reading them effortlessly and instantly. So those would be some considerations about the text that I would encourage you to explore and investigate with those older struggling readers, assuming that your students are having word recognition problems.
Excellent. Thank you for answering that. All right, I'm going to sign off for a while.
Okay. Don't go too far away, because we'll want you back here in a second. Okay, so I'm going to give a call to action to everybody who is participating in this webinar. No matter what your role is, no matter how you connect to reading or to education, There's something here for you. And this is the audience participation part for sure, because we want you to take this defining guide and we want you to use it to inform your work. So we are calling on all educators to find those opportunities to learn about the science of reading and to reflect on their practice. Really be thoughtful about what you're doing and why, and be okay with questioning what you're doing and be open to learning something new, to changing what you're doing. The very best way to make sure that what you're doing is lined up with what's effective is to collect data on your students. So that good old progress monitoring that allows you to check in repeatedly and find out if your student is learning what you're teaching. We are also calling on district and school administrators and school boards to prioritize professional development that is focused on the science of reading, to create those opportunities for teachers to learn, to support your staff to learn about the science of reading, and to adopt programs, practices, and systems that are aligned with the science of reading. We call on state departments of education to take advantage of experts within their state and in other states that can help inform the initiatives that they are rolling out in their state, to make sure that they are providing opportunities for leadership within the science of reading and opportunities for teachers to learn about the science of reading. We call on policymakers to provide solutions that will allow the application of reading science in schools. We want professional associations to create those learning opportunities, just like the Reading League has done for us here in this session. We want the scientists and researchers to stay connected to what's happening in schools. We want them to listen to educators and create research that helps inform what goes on in classrooms. We call on parents to stay informed and to put the pressure on their schools to implement research-based and aligned practices. We want universities to make sure that their coursework and their field experiences are allowing pre-service and graduate level educators to learn about and implement what's in the science of reading. We want pediatricians to be aware of the warning signs that they can screen for and talk with families about with even very young children. We call on publishers to align their products with the science of reading. And we call on federal agencies and policy-making entities and those philanthropic foundations to ask the questions, to support work that helps answer the questions that will inform us as we implement the science of reading. So that's your charge. We want you to take on this new learning. We want you to reflect on your current practices. We want you to stay open. This section of the defining guide is called something along the lines of being a good citizen of the scientific community. So this might really be stretching some of you in thinking about yourself as a member of the scientific community, but this is what you are now, like it or not. And this comes along with some elements that are sometimes a little bit challenging and can be tough to get used to, okay? So one thing that I want you to know is that science is not static. It's not something that you can pull off a shelf and sort of get your hands around. It's a process of seeking truth. It's a process of asking and answering questions, and it's a social process. So that happens within a community, and you are now a part of that community. So we need to understand that there is very little settled science. We're learning and changing what we understand about reading all the time. And that process is one that we have to stay open to, that when there's new information, we have to be willing to say, I've learned something new. I've changed the way that I've thought about that. this is what I used to think, and now I know something more or something different. We need to be kind and considerate with each other as we're learning. Sometimes when we start learning about the science of reading, we get very enthusiastic and we want to run around and make sure everybody is as enthusiastic as we are. We need to make sure that we are demonstrating a little bit of concern for other people who might not be as ready as we are to take on that new learning. I also want you to understand that sometimes there's not an answer to the question that you need guidance on in the classroom. We don't have science that can inform every single move that you make in schools. So sometimes you're going to have to step out on sort of a best understanding or a theory or your own experience. That's going to happen. And it's important in those cases to just know the difference when you're acting on your experience versus acting on research. And it's a process, I think, of getting comfortable with that, understanding the differences and getting comfortable moving forward with the best available evidence. And I want to just conclude by saying, when we have good, solid research to stand on, we should be using it. So there are areas within the science of reading that are fairly non-controversial, and we absolutely should be acting on and implementing what's known in those areas. Okay, so I want to wrap up here by reminding us where we started with literacy as the defining human right, this basic human right that regardless of the circumstances of a student's birth, they have access to. And it's our responsibility as educators to make sure that every student has that opportunity to use reading as that guiding light, as that opportunity to open doors for them in their life. So this is it's a big charge, but I know that all of you are up to the task. Okay, so here's my summary and next steps for you. I want to encourage you to commit to learning more about the science of reading. You can do that through the defining guide. I want you to download it, read it, share it with all your friends. I want you to commit this week to one of these actions, to think about your instruction, really reflect on it. Think about the instructional materials that you're using. Have a conversation with a coworker. Maybe there was something that was talked about in this session that you'd like to know more about. Maybe you can find somebody who would have that opportunity to learn with you. If you are inclined, reach out to your college or university. Partner with them as a field placement site. Partner with them in some professional development that could be provided locally. Give them some feedback about what you did or didn't learn in your training program. Or call your elected official if you are so inclined in that way of advocacy to share about the kinds of supports that are needed for students in schools. So I want you to think before we totally wrap up here, which one of these actions you're willing to commit to. What's going to be your next step? Okay, so we have one final poll question before we take the remaining questions out of the question box. So Jesse, I'm going to ask you to launch number 7. So what topics would you like to have future webinars on? And if there's something that's not listed here that you'd like a webinar on, there was contact information for the Reading League Georgia and the Reading League Florida on the first slide tonight. So you'll see that in the handout. You can connect with them through their websites and their Facebook pages. So last chance to get your 2 cents in for what you'd like to learn some more about. Okay, we have a front runner by a lot. Effective instructional practices. Okay, very good. No surprise. Yeah, let's get to the nitty-gritty meat of those effective instructional practices. Okay, a couple of slides of resources as Nicole is collecting questions for us here. How you get the defining guide itself, one of the videos that's included in the defining guide is really intriguing scans of how the brain learns to read. If you're looking for kind of an introductory document about the science of reading, I happen to like this research brief called Narrowing the Third Grade Reading Gap. There's a really nice paper, it's a document actually by Stanovich and Stanovich called Using Research and Reason in Education. It is not new, it's an oldie, but a goodie. It really sets a nice tone for using research in education. There is a nice blog that was also published in Nomanus that is the key components of a research paper. And the publication, the IES publication that's listed here is an infographic that's a very similar kind of easy to access components of a research paper. I included a publication from one of, or several of my colleagues at Mount St. Joseph University. It's a research study on Project Ready, which is a early childhood intervention that's free in public domain. And this is a nice journal article that I think is pretty accessible. If you want to get your feet wet with reading research, that's one I would point you to. And then I'm also sharing a blog that I wrote about being a member of a scientific community. Okay, so we have some time for questions. So Nicole, I'm going to call on you to, you said there were a lot, so maybe we don't have time for all of them, but I'm going to let you prioritize those.
Okay, so let's start with some questions around effective instructional practice. That seems to be a pretty hot topic these days. So one question, and actually they're kind of related, is what is the current research around standalone spelling lists? And there was another question I'm going to find about spelling as well. Is there research on discrete spelling lists?
So what I would point you to here when it comes to spelling is thinking about what I mentioned about the network that gets built in students' brains, that as students are learning those letter sound relationships, we want them to be applying what they're learning and practicing both by writing the words, so spelling them, and by reading them in the context of connected text. So that would be like reading it in a decodable book. So what seems to be most helpful is when we can make those connections and when spelling is not a separate activity, but when it is connected and integrated with the phonics and decoding instruction. That seems to be very helpful for students. It seems to be supportive of building those connections in students' brains. It allows an additional practice opportunity. So spelling that's lined up with the decoding instruction seems to be the direction that we want to move in, rather than having a separate list that maybe comes from vocabulary from some kind of reading selection, or just a random list of words with different patterns. Is that getting at the question that you saw?
Yep, I think so. I think it kind of addresses both of those questions. Those are good questions.
Yes,
another question related to effective instruction. This one is interesting. It's about reading aloud might become a habit to students who maybe it would result in reading aloud later as students are older. Like maybe they would keep doing that, I guess. And then eventually that is not helpful. So is there a concern that if you do that reading aloud practice with students that they will want to read aloud all the time, and then if eventually that will negatively impact them?
Yeah, I'm kind of smiling because I think everybody's had, a kid in their experience, or maybe in your current reality, who struggles a little bit to read silently, right? Like maybe everybody's reading something in the classroom and you can hear the one student who is reading aloud. Usually that's fairly easy to take care of, with letting them whisper perhaps at first, but then eventually having them internalize that language so that they are not reading out loud when they're in a setting. I've never worked with a student. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen. I'm just saying I don't have personal experience with a student who's persisted in reading out loud when it was inappropriate. I've certainly had to provide direction and support for students to get to the point they could read to themselves silently. But I haven't had anybody really persist in that. So I don't know, Nicole, do you have something to add, or any of the other?
I can't speak to that with any real confidence, only because what I would do personally is I would do a review of the literature. And I would look secondary kids, like I would kind of constrain it to looking, because you really want to know if this is going to impact children when they're in middle school or secondary school. And I would put in my search engine, I guess, I would put in secondary students, I would put in read aloud, that kind of thing, and just see if there's anything out there that would, and then take it from there. And I think I would keep trying to but there's nothing that I could think of in my mind that I have read from in a research paper or any kind of journal that spoke to that. So I can't really say one way or the other there. So
yeah, I love your idea, because I can't either think of any research that I've encountered. So that's a really good response when you don't know, is to do a search. I like that.
Yeah. Okay, here's another one. This one is around phonemic awareness in phonics. So this person was asking, what's your opinion of districts mandating to teach a curriculum to fidelity when it is lacking in the areas of phonemic awareness in phonics?
Well, that's like a setup, isn't it?
I know, it's not fair, is it?
That's my opinion of bad practices.
Right, that's not fair.
Yeah, I have a low opinion of that. So, this person probably understands that there's lots of research about treatment fidelity or treatment integrity, or this idea of really measuring the extent to which you implement an approach or a method or a program as designed. That's important, because you're not going to get the outcome that has been found in the research if you don't implement the program or the approach in the same way. If you are tinkering around with it and making your own, you can't expect to get the same result. Now, that's only true or that's only something you want to hold people to, as far as making a policy, or holding people accountable to treatment integrity, if the treatment is effective, right? So if the treatment doesn't have any evidence behind it, if it's missing, I think, as the person said, components that are known to be effective in the research, then that doesn't seem like a sound practice to require that everybody across the district implement it as designed. So that's,
yeah, absolutely. I really feel for teachers who are in that position. And the one thing that people might want to consider is actually using this resource, the defining guide. And if you can just get your toe in the door with some folks in your school and just open their mind a little bit. And that's one of the things I think the defining guide does well.
Yeah.
Is it really is a very concrete, very easy to read, and maybe bringing some of this to the light of the people who are making decisions and talking about fidelity and implementation. Maybe that would help.
I think that's an excellent suggestion. I think you have to approach that very carefully. And when you have something like a document, like the defining guide, that can help you have that conversation, it's very useful. If you have the actual research that you can bring with you, that can also be helpful. Not everybody's persuaded by research, but I think if you can go to your administrators, I think this is the scenario in the question, go to your administrators with something in hand that that allows you to say, I've just read this, or I've been listening to this, or here's what I'm learning. And this doesn't seem to line up with this program that we're asked or required to use. I need to have a conversation, and I would like to explore this with you because there seems to be a conflict here. And I know that you and I both want to do what is best for students, what's going to get our students to good reading outcomes most efficiently. And I have some questions about this. And I think that kind of approach can open up a line of communication. You have to be really thinking about, especially administrators, allowing them to change their mind, to change their policies, to change their directives in a way that you're not going to then wag your finger and say, well, that's just, you know, the pendulum swinging, or you don't know, or, you know, you have to really, I think, be aware of that from a human perspective. That how would you want to be told that you're no longer current? How would you best receive that information? How would you like to be told that you're wrong? You have to really have that in mind when you're approaching those kinds of conversations. So there's sensitive ways to do that. I'm not telling you you should avoid the conversation. I just want to be clear. I think you should go face that conversation, but you should do it in a way that's mindful of how it will be heard, because you want to get to the end goal, which is the most possibly effective and efficient practices to get the best results for your students. So keep that as the focus of that conversation.
Excellent advice. Okay, I have one more question, and then Jesse, I'm sure, is going to wrap it up. But here's the last question. It is, what are your thoughts about how the science-based approach to reading instruction compares to whole language? What is more appropriate?
How much time
that's a great way to end this. I know you have to do it in like 1 minute.
Yeah, so there's very little from the whole language approach that has held up to scientific inquiry. So I'll say that as a provocative ending statement. We used to think that reading was a visual activity. We used to think that students would sort of digest and remember whole words. And so the whole language was a lot about that kind of rote memorization. It was about going straight to the meaning of what students were reading. It was about using the context of the sentence to decode the words. And all of those practices have been disproven. And we know that those practices don't align with how our brain actually learns to read. So we know that we have to recognize that reading is a language-based skill, and we have to support students to be able to crack that code of the written language and bring the print into their spoken environment, their spoken language, so that they can understand what they read just as well as they understand what they hear in speech. So I really am going to end it.
Thank you. And I'm sorry we cannot do all of these questions. We were so many great questions, but thank you. I'm going to sign off.
Thanks, Nicole.
All right. Well, I think that we are at our time here. It is 8:30. I want to thank the Reading League Georgia for co-sponsoring this event with us, and thank you, Dr. Stoller, for your always excellent breadth and depth of knowledge, and for spending some time outlining this really important topic. We hope everyone is energized by this information, and you're going to go out and tackle your instruction and your classes with a sort of renewed energy, or a redoubled energy here. And so thank you, and we hope you have a great night.
Thank you so much.